The Miracle of the Seventh-Day Ox. The story of Nikolai Panchak, a Russian SDA pastor imprisoned in a Siberian prison camp for his faith. In our last reading, Nikolai refused to work on his first Sabbath in the Siberian prison, and as a result, he was severely beaten and horsewhipped. Now he faces his second Sabbath. Chapter 12 of the Miracle of the Seventh-Day Ox. The warden turned impatiently. "Panchak, get a move on it," he snapped. "Try to keep up." Nikolai hurriedly fell in step behind the warden as they exited the building. What would happen next? Was he going to be given a pass from work that day? Was he going to be allowed to rest and worship according to his convictions? The warden walked to one of the sod sheds and opened the door. It was the stables where old Maxim was kept, and it smelled of it. There were no windows in the building, so the inside appeared dark and foreboding. This didn't look good. Undoubtedly for Nikolai, things were going from bad to worse. Was he going to be beaten again? Was he going to be tortured? Nikolai cringed. Was he going to be executed? Suddenly, Nikolai began to panic. During his early morning prayers, his imagination had run wild with all kinds of abuse that he knew they could heap on him. But he hadn't really thought of death. Not really. Death had always seemed so remote out here, where there was so much work to be done. In a camp like this, where the prisoners did all the work, executing a prisoner seemed pointless. Nikolai knew this kind of logic bordered on insanity. He had to get a grip. He watched as the warden walked to a corner of the dark stables where a wooden box sat. It didn't look to be more than a yard long or high, and possibly half a yard wide. Nikolai's heart began to hammer wildly in his chest like a caged animal. Was this the end? He tried to calm his racing heart, but there was no time to think, no time to collect his wits. Then he remembered his prayer that morning and his promise to God. He had pledged himself to suffer anything for God, so why not now? Why not this? Whatever the warden had in store for him, it couldn't be worse than what Jesus had suffered for him. The warden lifted off the top of the wooden box. Even in the dim shadows of the sod stable, Nikolai could see that the box was empty. "Get in," the warden ordered. "Get in?" Nikolai echoed. The warden didn't reply, but motioned with his head toward the crate. "The box? I'm supposed to get in the box? Do I need to spell it out for you? Yes, you're supposed to get in the box." The stables echoed the stillness of the moment. "Now, get moving. I don't have all day." Nikolai took one last look at the warden and then stepped toward the box. He lifted a leg and got inside. It was smaller than it looked. "Sit down," the warden ordered. As the lid slammed down over him, a shower of dust choked Nikolai, making him wheeze. "Hope you like your new home," the warden called as he turned to go. The wooden slats of the box were thick, so it looked like it would be next to impossible to break his way out. And besides, what would it accomplish? The warden would just build a stronger box to hold him. He had heard of boxes like this one being used to keep prisoners locked up. But this box had so many cobwebs, it didn't look as though it had been used in years. Maybe the box was used for the hardest of criminals. Maybe the other prisoners just behaved themselves and didn't get themselves into predicaments as Nikolai had. The light from the open doorway told Nikolai that there were cracks in the side of the box. He would have no problem breathing, but keeping his legs from cramping up was going to be a trick. He couldn't stand up, and he couldn't lie down, so he couldn't stretch his legs out. Nikolai wanted to give up in despair, but he knew that wasn't an option. Not when he had promised himself that he was going to be true to God and be his steadfast witness. Suffering was the least of his worries. Failing to trust God was a bigger concern right now. Nikolai closed his eyes and leaned against the inside wall of the box. He knew this was not going to be a pleasant experience. In fact, it promised to be downright excruciating. How long would they wait before they let him out of the box? Days? Weeks? Would they bring him food? Would they give him water? Would they let him out to go to the bathroom? Please, Lord, don't let me become discouraged, he prayed. Don't let my faith in you fail. As the hours slowly passed, the light in the stable doorway changed direction and then finally began to grow dim. About that time, Oleg, the ox cart driver, came into the shed leading old Maxim. Oleg gave the animal food and water and then left. Nikolai thought Oleg might at least have offered him some water, but then realized that he should have asked. What had he been thinking? Oleg probably didn't even know that Nikolai was locked in the box in the shed. Hello, Maxim, Nikolai finally called to the ox, trying to cheer himself up. I hope your day was better than mine. As Nikolai sat in the box, he could hear the old ox munching the sedge grass in his manger. He thought about how hard the ox had to work as a beast of burden every day, and he even found himself feeling sorry for the ox. Right now, though, he thought, he would gladly change place with the ox. Even if he had to pull an ox cart loaded with water barrels all the way from the spring, it would be better than sitting in this box all day. The end of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. As darkness settled in, the mosquitoes came in droves. They bit at Nikolai's neck and face until he finally stopped swatting at them and gave up the fight. Right now, the worst thing about being in the box was the mosquitoes. But he sensed that not being able to stretch his legs was going to be a nightmare. Eventually, he dozed. He didn't sleep well with the mosquitoes everywhere, but he did doze off. Somewhere in the night, he awoke and couldn't go back to sleep. His mouth was dry. He hadn't had water all day, and he wondered when they would bring him some. Had the guards forgotten that he would need water? He was hungry too. Who could say when he'd get a chance to eat again? But it was the circulation in his legs that worried him most. By now, his ankles and feet felt numb with stiffness from his legs being bent up so closely to his body. He tried to get the blood flowing in his legs, but it was difficult because the box was so small. There just wasn't enough room to stretch out inside the box. At times like this, he wished he were a smaller man. If he hadn't felt so miserable, Nikolai might have smiled at such a thought. Being a bit shorter would have allowed him some room to get more exercise in the small box. But there was to be no relief for the numbness that kept coming back to his lower legs. Finally, he began to pray again, as he had a dozen times since being locked up in the box. It was the only thing that made him feel better. That and the verses of scripture he quoted to bring himself comfort. When the sun finally came up, he felt as if it had been the longest night of his life. When Oleg came to get Maxim, Nikolai asked him if he could have some water. Oleg was startled to hear Nikolai's voice from the box. "What are you doing in there?" Oleg asked, peering into the shadows. "Did the warden put you in that box?" "He did." Nikolai felt a bit embarrassed, but he decided he wouldn't try to hide the reason. "I refused to work yesterday on the Sabbath, so he put me in here to punish me." "I heard that you had been punished, but I didn't know where you were." Oleg shook his head. "I'd better not give you water. They might not like it." "Can you ask one of the guards to bring me some then? I think they may have forgotten me here. No one's been out here except you since they put me in here yesterday." "I'll see what I can do." But the guards never came with any water or any food either. All day, Nikolai worked to keep his legs moving, and all day he prayed. By now, he knew that his time in the box was going to be a long ordeal. He didn't quite know what to expect, because the warden didn't say how long he would have to stay in the box. Every time he heard footsteps, he thought it might be someone coming to bring him water or food, or to let him out of the box to stretch. Sometime late that afternoon, a guard did come into the shed to give Nikolai a can of water, but no food. The water felt cool and wet to his parched lips and throat. And yet, as thirsty as he was, Nikolai wisely decided to save some of the water for later. Oleg came in with Maxim later that night, and again Nikolai was glad to have the company of someone to talk to, even if it was just an ox. The night passed in extreme discomfort. The mosquitoes made it almost impossible for him to sleep, and of course, the numbing pain in his legs was the worst of all. Nikolai wished that he could get out of the box to use a bathroom, but no one let him out, so the box soon developed an unpleasant odor. Unfortunately, there was nothing Nikolai could do about it. The hours slowly passed, with Oleg and Maxim leaving early the next morning, then returning again sometime before dark. A guard came with water again, but still no food. Night came once more, and by now, it took all of Nikolai's faith and energy just to pray. Did anyone care about him? Was there no value to his life? And what about God? Did he care that Nikolai was suffering? Nikolai knew the answer to that last question, but he was really feeling sorry for himself by now. God could help relieve his suffering, but he was not choosing to do so right now. There had to be a good reason, of course. Through all those long days filled with pain and loneliness and frustrated faith, Nikolai held to the scripture promises he had always believed in. Satan wanted to make him suffer, but God loved him more than he could possibly imagine. There was a battle going on between good and evil, a war zone in which Nikolai was suffering as much pain and persecution as Satan could muster. Jesus suffered for me with pain that was indescribable. Why should my experience for him be any different? Nikolai tried to bolster his courage with these thoughts, but it was difficult. As with the story of Job, Nikolai knew that some pain and heartache could not be explained except in the light of the invisible war going on in the supernatural world. When he thought about it in this way, it seemed to help more than anything else. One thing was for sure. While Nikolai was locked up in the box, he could have his Sabbath rest. It wasn't exactly the place he would have chosen to spend the Lord's day, but at least he didn't have to work. No matter how Nikolai looked at it, he had to admit it was a blessing in disguise. The end of chapter 13. Chapter 14. The miracle of the seventh-day ox. The weekend passed, and Monday came and went. By now, the thought of food had almost gone from Nikolai's mind. He had not eaten in 9 days. It was as if his body had slipped into another world that no longer required him to eat. Of course, he was getting weaker every day, but being in the box didn't require much movement, so it also required very little energy. However, there was a dull, throbbing pain in his legs, and that scared Nikolai more than anything. During the first few days in the box, the pain had been pretty bad whenever he moved his legs. Now, he couldn't make them move of their own accord. It was as if there were logs of wood attached to his body at the hips. He couldn't really feel them much anymore. He worked on them all the time, using his arms to move them every day, many times a day. By Tuesday of the second week, the box smelled rank beyond description, and the flies were everywhere. It was a living nightmare. Nikolai no longer worried about the warden. He no longer worried about food or water. He just prayed that God would give him the strength to make it through another day. Around noon on the 10th day, Nikolai heard footsteps. He peered through the slats and saw the warden standing in the doorway. Yuri, the barracks guard, was with him. "Open the box," the warden said. That was all. It was as if this were a mere formality in the life and duties of a warden at the prison camp. To Nikolai, it had been the worst experience of his life. Yuri opened the lid of the box. "Ooh!" he sputtered as he held his hand over his mouth. "You smell putrid! Get out of the box," he ordered, shaking his head in disgust. "You're free to go." But Nikolai couldn't stand. Yuri reached down and lifted Nikolai out of the box. When he saw that Nikolai couldn't walk, his face grew serious, and a look of compassion filled his eyes. He helped Nikolai to a bed of straw and let him lie down. "I'll be all right," Nikolai assured him with a weak smile. Right now, he just wanted to be alone so that he could scream out in pain if he needed to. For 10 days, he hadn't been able to move his legs properly, and now the pain of moving them was almost as excruciating as having his legs cramped up in the box. All the rest of that day, Nikolai lay on the straw, trying to gain his strength and flex his legs so that he could walk on them. Yuri bought him a tin plate of borscht at the supper hour, and Nikolai managed to eat a few bites. he wasn't foolish enough to eat it all. After being deprived of food for so long, he knew his stomach would never be able to handle that much food. Before dusk, Oleg and Maxim came in from their long day of hauling water. Once again, Nikolai felt a sense of kinship with the ox and was glad for his company. As the night settled in, Nikolai didn't even try to go to the barracks, but stayed in the stables with Maxim instead. In fact, when the ox finally lay down on the straw, Nikolai crawled over to warm himself by the animal's big body. Nikolai then dropped into a sleep so deep that he never even noticed the mosquitoes swarming around him. Surprisingly, they didn't bother him much that night. Maybe it was the fact that he smelled so bad. The next morning, Nikolai felt much better. He could stand some and even walk a bit. The guard bought more food for him, a bowl of borscht and some Russian black bread. Again, Nikolai was careful about the amount he ate, but he did manage to eat more than he had the day before. He cleaned up and then went back to work with Vadim, though he found he couldn't lift much of anything. He didn't have any strength in his arms or legs, and he tired easily. Not surprising, Vadim looked at Nikolai as if the preacher man were crazy. "You must have a death wish," he chided. "Whatever would possess you to put yourself through 10 days of torture in that box?" Nikolai tried to explain about his love for God and God's love for the human race. He tried to explain about his sacred devotion to the Sabbath. But Vadim just shook his head in disbelief and muttered to himself under his breath. By Thursday morning, Nikolai could get around pretty well, though he did have a limp in his stride. Friday arrived, and for the first time since he had been pulled from the box, Nikolai allowed himself to think about what the next morning might bring. To him, Sabbath was a very special day, whether he was in a church or a lonely prison camp. However, Sabbath also meant that he was going to have to face the warden again. What would the high-ranking officer do this time? The first time, Nikolai had been severely beaten by both Yuri and the warden. The second Sabbath, they had locked him up in a box for 10 days. And the third time around, would they finally give up? Or would the persecutions continue? Nikolai wondered, how much worse could things get? He was sure that there would be another confrontation with the warden, and he dreaded it. But he also knew that he had to remain faithful to God no matter what. He couldn't give up now. The Sabbath was his special blessing from God. With all his heart, he wanted to honor the sacred day and the Creator God who designed it. The end of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. The night was moving slowly into the first shades of dawn when Nikolai suddenly awoke. What it was that awakened him, he couldn't say. It wasn't the noise of anyone else in the barracks. They were all still sleeping, though Nikolai was sure their laborious snoring could have kept him awake all night if he hadn't been so tired. It wasn't the sound of birds. There were very few songbirds out here on the Siberian steppes. Nikolai wondered if it was his mind working overtime that had awakened him with a start. And what could he expect? The ordeal through which he had been during the past 2 weeks had been horrible, dreadfully uncomfortable. And what about the next go-round with the warden? Nikolai feared it would be as bad as the times before, maybe worse. But he was calm, surprisingly so, and it felt strange. To be sure, he didn't relish the idea of spending more time in a box, if that's what the warden had in store for him. But for some reason, Nikolai didn't feel as though he needed to escape the approaching hardship the warden might bring. In fact, he felt very little anxiety over it. So why couldn't he sleep? Maybe he just needed more strength, the kind of strength he could only get through prayer. Nikolai slipped out of bed and onto his knees to pray to his Heavenly Father. It was wonderful to be able to call on the one who could give him help in time of need. Wonderful to feel the presence of the Holy Spirit kneeling with him on the hard dirt floor beside that narrow bunk. The longer he prayed, the more sure he was that he was going to have to suffer more. He would not be delivered from trouble. He would not be spared humiliation and pain. That's not the way it had usually worked for Nikolai, and he was okay with that right now. His faith might falter when he was tired or lonely or weak. But this morning in the cool dawn of the Siberian summer, everything was going to be all right. All too soon, the sun rose, and the 5 o'clock wake-up call came from the guards. The prisoners in the barracks slowly stirred and then rolled out of bed to avoid having the guards come in and flush them out. For Nikolai, another Sabbath day had dawned, and again he found himself at attention, standing in front of the bunkhouse. Again, Yuri dismissed the men after roll call, but this time he kept his eye on Nikolai. Nikolai knew it was pointless to prolong the agony of the moment. He didn't make a move, and of course, Yuri noticed it. He came to where Nikolai was standing and stood with his big feet planted wide in front of the prisoner. "Please don't tell me that you're going to refuse to work again," he demanded in exasperation. "Because if it's true, I think I've probably met the dumbest man alive." Yuri continued to stare at Nikolai with something akin to awe on his face. He tried to hide it, but it remained there long enough to make them both uncomfortable. And then the guard appeared to regain his composure as he seemed to brush the feeling off. "Forget it," he half shouted. "Just go over to the warden's office right now." Nikolai knew Yuri was angry, and really, he had a right to be. What did he know of Nikolai or his God? What did he know of the love of a creator for his children, and the devotion Nikolai felt for this God who had come to die for humanity? All Yuri knew was that this stubborn Christian pastor was making trouble and upsetting the routine of the camp. Within seconds, Nikolai had crossed the compound and was waiting in the doorway of the warden's office. "What are you doing here, Pancha?" The warden's eyes narrowed with surprise and skepticism and anger all in the same moment. But Nikolai said nothing. He just stood at attention, his eyes focused forward. What could he say? "I asked you a question, preacher man." Nikolai knew he dared not wait to answer the irate warden. But how could he make the warden understand why he wanted to honor the seventh day of the week? The warden was the product of a society that taught that there was no such thing as a loving, personal God. He had been working in the military for decades and was indoctrinated with the concept that the only real answer to life was military force. "I can't work today, sir," Nikolai began. "I can't dishonor God's holy Sabbath day." The warden's face contorted contorted with rage. He ground his teeth together, then brought a fist down on his desk. "You're impossible, Panchak. I have never in all my days met a man with your stubborn stupidity." He rose to his feet and pushed Nikolai back out through the open doorway. "God!" he shouted, looking down the hallway. "Get this man out of my office and take him back to the box." The sound of running footsteps could be heard, and then Yuri was there, a look of disbelief on his face. "Take Panchak back to the box, Yuri. He likes it so much, he wants to spend another 10 days there." Yuri hung his head and then finally motioned for Nikolai to follow him to the stable. When they arrived at the box, he lifted the lid and motioned with his head for Nikolai to get in. When the lid dropped down on Nikolai and the dust had settled, the preacher man had time to think about his decision. He wasn't sorry. He had no regrets. He knew being locked in the box was going to be uncomfortable and excruciating, but he wasn't worried. For some strange reason, he felt no anxiety or fear or dread of the next 10 days to come. It was all so bizarre, he couldn't explain it. Some days he knew he was going to feel abandoned and alone, no doubt. But right here and now, he was determined that he wouldn't lay the blame on God. It wasn't the Lord's fault that he was in this tiny prison of a box. It was the devil's fault, and the warden's, of course. The end of chapter 15 of The Miracle of the Seventh-day Ox, the story of Nikolai Panchak, an SDA pastor in a Russian prison camp in Siberia.